What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish at the Moment. I'm packing the garage, preparing for another Catch 15 challenge. This week we're headed to Lake Spavinaw in Oklahoma. This is a lot smaller lake than I usually fish, but the reason I'm going here is because this lake has offshore aquatic vegetation in the form of hydrilla and some milfoil. I know a lot of you guys have grass in your lake that might be 6 to 10 feet deep, and it's kind of daunting to figure out how to break down a lake that has grass everywhere and it basically just all looks the same. So in this video, I'm gonna explain how I prepare to fish a grass lake, and I'll be going out and trying to catch 15 pounds on Lake Spavinaw in a video coming out later this week. Let's get into it. As always, let's start out with my map study for this upcoming fishing trip. If we take a look at Lake Spavinaw, the average water visibility is maybe 2.5 to 3 feet. The maximum depth might be no more than 30 to 35 feet of water. There is a lot of good hard cover like rocks and wood on the lower end of the lake, and then on the upper end of the lake there's a big grass flat that is basically on average 3 to 4 feet deep with a few ditches that run through the flat. There are a lot of different ways to tackle this lake, but we're going to be fishing here in the middle of November. Normally in November, I find that the best places to look on these grass lakes is further up into the creeks or further up on the bigger flats that you can find in shallower water. The flat that I'm going to be focusing on is on the east side of Lake Spavinaw, and if we take a look at Google Earth, then take the lake down using historical imagery, you can actually see what this flat looks like with no water there. It's a pretty nondescript flat. It pretty much looks the same all the way across, with the exception of a few ditches that run through this flat. Ditches are basically creek channels that feed from the rivers or small little creeks that form the lake. If we take a look closely at this flat, you can notice two distinct ditches, one that's very obvious and one that's not so obvious. This obvious one, I've actually dropped waypoints around, and I'm going to transfer these waypoints over to my fish finder. And I made a video explaining how to take the lake down on Google Earth, how to put waypoints on and transfer those waypoints straight to your fish finder. I'll link that video down below, and I also have a step-by-step guide on my website, fishatthemoment.com, that'll show you how to transfer those waypoints to your fish finder. If we take a closer look at this ditch, you can tell there's some deeper water in the center of that ditch, given the fact that there's still water there when the lake is drawn down. I've actually fished this flat several times, and I know the center of that ditch is between 6 and 8 feet deep. There's then a flat that surrounds it that's maybe 1 foot to 3 feet deep, and there's a break from the flat into that ditch where you usually find grass. That grass will grow up within 6 inches of the surface and sometimes even top out on the surface on top of the flat, and there'll be no grass in the center of that ditch. This creates a hard edge in the grass because there's no grass in the ditch and there's a lot of grass on that flat. That hard edge is usually a great place to find fish in the summertime on Lake Spavinaw, and I'm sure there may be some fish holding there as well this fall. There's another ditch I plan to fish that's a lot less obvious than the first one. I marked it out with some pins here, and if we remove them, you can see that there's a squiggly line going through this flat. That's an old creek channel, and it's maybe only a 6-inch difference from the rest of the flat. The main part of the flat might be 2 feet deep, and the center of that ditch is in 2.5 feet of water. It's a very subtle depth change, and really all it does is create a small depression in that grass. But any sort of depression or hole in the grass is a great feeding area for bass, and these are the types of areas I really like to focus on. In addition, the center of these shallow ditches like this usually have harder bottom than the surrounding flat. This attracts bait fish, and also if there's any rain in the fall, the current will push through that little ditch or that little channel, and it'll create a good ambush point for bass to feed on bait fish. These are the two primary ditches that you can see in this flat, but there's also a few ditches that are way up past the flat. If we go further east, you'll see that they drop into an old creek. The mouth of these old creeks form a ditch into that flat that's just a few feet deeper. I've actually never fished these areas before because usually I can catch those fish out in front of those creeks on that bigger flat. But because we're here in November, there may be some fish that actually pushed all the way back in those creeks in the fall and are making their way out, and I could find them in the mouths of those creeks in those small depressions. I'm definitely gonna check them out when I'm on the lake, if I can get my boat over to them. That flat is pretty shallow, but I think I can sneak my way over there. Now that you've seen the primary areas I'm gonna focus on Lake Spavinaw, let's walk through some of the equipment I plan on throwing. First up, let's start with the thumbnail of this video that you may have not ever seen before. This is a chatterbait with a tube on it. This is something I came up with about 6 months ago because I was trying to find a way to skip a chatterbait better around boat docks. When I'm fishing a buzzbait up shallow, I usually put a horny toad on the back of that buzzbait. This allows me to skip it a lot easier than when I have the buzzbait with only the skirt on there. It adds some weight and it also gives it a flat surface. I thought about doing the same thing with a chatterbait, but I found that a lot of times the trailer would fall down, it wouldn't stay up very well while I was skipping it, and it didn't give enough of a profile to really make it appealing to my eye. Therefore, I pulled out one of these old Strike King tube technology tubes that I've had for like 15 years. I think I got them when I was like 8 years old. And they still make them now, but it's basically a 4.5-inch flipping tube. And the reason I'm using a flipping tube is it has a hard, solid head to that tube. Tubes are a great bait for smallmouth up north. I used to flip them all the time on grass lakes. And so I don't see why this tube setup wouldn't work on Lake Spavinaw. Again, you have a tube like this, the head is nice and solid and the body is more thin, so you can get a good hookup ratio on those fish when they actually bite down on it. You're not gonna restrict the hook gap, but also you have these appendages that are floating around. They're probably going to give off some good action around that grass. The one thing I do with this chatterbait is I use an old original chatterbait. There's no real advantage to using like a jackhammer or anything. It's like 15 bucks. Just buy like a $4 chatterbait, but get one in a heavier size. This is a 5/8 ounce size chatterbait because it really helps keep that tube on the jig head. I'll basically just thread that tube onto the chatterbait, and what will happen is it'll actually puncture a hole in the top of that tube's head. The thicker head of that 5/8 ounce chatterbait will mold itself around that thicker part of the tube head and hold that tube in place. This is going to prevent that tube from sliding down. You can pull on it pretty hard even without super gluing it, and it will stay in place. And then all I do is trim up the top of that tube so that it's flush with that jig head. And I want to actually leave some of that jig head exposed so that you can get metal on metal contact from that blade and the head. I just take some scissors and just slowly trim up that head until there's some of the metal remaining, because again, you want that metal to metal contact on that chatterbait for the sound. But that tube just gives it a little bit thinner profile, and it gives these fish a different look than what they're used to seeing. A lot of guys just throw a regular chatterbait with a skirt and with a Swimbait trailer or whatever, but I'm sure there's not that many anglers who are throwing a tube on the back of that chatterbait. So that's something I'm going to plan on throwing, maybe to try to beat some of the fishing pressure and give these fish a unique look. I don't know if anyone's tried this before. I'm sure someone has. I've never seen it before, but it's something I'm definitely going to start experimenting with more. As far as my setup for this chatterbait, I'm just throwing it on a 7'2" medium heavy action crankbait rod from Denali. This is a KOVERT Lite series rod. I like to throw my chatterbaits on a rod that has more tip to it, because what happens with this chatterbait is that when those fish actually eat the bait, they're going to compress that blade forward. And then what you're gonna have to do when you set the hook is actually pull, and that blade will kick out, and a lot of times it will pop the fish's mouth open. That blade kicks from this position up and it pops the mouth open, and you need to have a little bit of give in your rod to give that bait some time to stay in the fish's mouth and re-hook that fish. This is something I learned from Rick Clunn and a bunch of other guys who have struggled with chatterbaits over the years because of that inherent property of the fish eating this chatterbait like this, that blade popping their mouth open and then missing fish. I'm just pairing that with some 15-pound fluorocarbon line. This is Seagar and Vizex. I'm throwing that on a 7-to-1 Abu Garcia Black Max Z reel. It's a $59 reel I got a couple years ago. I don't know if they still make them anymore, but it's just a cheap reel, 7-to-1, and I'm gonna be burning that chatterbait through the grass. I'm basically just gonna throw it in the edges of those ditches, maybe reel through the center of those ditches, or up on top of the flat. Just kind of mix it up and throw that bait around. The next bait I always have tied on when I'm fishing offshore grass is a lipless crankbait. This is a Strike King Red Eye Shad, and it's the tungsten 2-tap version. I'm throwing it in the Sam Rayburn red craw color. I like to throw a red crankbait in the fall especially when fishing around grass. It seems like a lot of those fish will feed up on crawfish in that grass, but even if they're feeding on shad, they'll still eat this red crankbait. It just gives them something a little bit different to look at. That tungsten 2-tap has a unique sound, and I really like the sound of that crankbait. I'll put it up to my mic here. I like the sound of that lipless crankbait because it has a harder knock, a little bit more of a solid knock than like the BBs that you get in a lot of other lipless crankbaits, and it seems to get me a few extra bites from throwing other ones just through years of experimentation. I'm just upgrading this 1/2 ounce lipless crankbait with some 4/0 Gamakatsu EWG hooks. I like some EWG hooks when fishing in the grass. It seems to rip through the grass a little bit better for me. And I'm just pairing that on a 7-foot medium light action Quantum Tour Edition rod. I don't think they make this rod anymore, but any 7-foot medium light or 7-foot crankbait rod will work. I'm pairing that with 14-pound monofilament line. Again, I'm throwing monofilament with this crankbait. I just feel like it gets me better hookup ratios, land more fish with it. I may have to switch away from the monofilament if the grass is especially thick, because a lot of times that lipless crankbait won't pull through the grass because that mono has too much stretch. I have an extra reel right here with some 15-pound fluorocarbon just in case, so that way I can switch it out if I need to. But 14-pound monofilament is what I'm gonna start with a 6:3:1 gear ratio, Abu Garcia Black Max reel, 50 bucks. So that is a great tool to throw in the exact same places I'm throwing the Chatterbait. I'm gonna kind of switch between them. I usually find that the Chatterbait is a really good search tool because it comes through the grass a little bit better than the lipless crankbait. But if they're short striking this Chatterbait, you can pull out the lipless crankbait and usually get those fish that are short striking the Chatterbait, or if they're biting it weird, you can catch them on this. So that's the 2 baits that are gonna be my primary reaction baits to put my keepers in the boat. Another reaction bait I plan on fishing through the grass is a Megabass Magdraft Freestyle Swimbait. It's a 6-inch swimbait on an owner flashy swimmer hook. It's an 8/0 hook with a 1/2 ounce belly weight on it. You can see it has a little spinner down there. It's a little willow leaf blade. And I have a 1/2 ounce size because I really want to work this thing quickly through the grass. I find that speed in the grass is very important. So I was thinking about maybe going to like a 1/4 ounce or a 3/8 ounce, but I opted to go to a 1/2 ounce belly weight so I can really keep the speed of the swimbait going and trick some of those fish that are trying to ambush those bait fish in the grass. I went with more of a greenish color. It's kind of almost like a perch color because I find that a lot of those bait fish will start to take on the color of the grass when they're up there. You could go for like a pearl or a white swimbait, but I find that I get better hookup ratios in the grass when I match my bait's color a little bit closer to the grass itself. With the swimbait, I'm basically pairing it on a 7-foot 2 heavy action rod. This is a Denali KOVERT Lite series. Very little tip. It's a big owner beast hook, so I want something that doesn't have much tip, and once they eat this thing, I want to be able to set the hook hard and bring them straight to the boat. Throwing this with some 17-pound Seagarten Vizex fluorocarbon, and I'm putting that on a 7:1 gear ratio Cast King Mag Jaws reel. It's just a $79, $69 reel I got on Amazon. This setup here is really going to be focused on targeting those bigger fish, potentially after I have a limit, or if I just feel like I need to get an upgrade to a 4 or 5 pounder. This bait is probably not going to get the numbers, and I might get some short strikes from some 2 and 3 pounders, but if there's a 5 pounder in that area, it'll definitely eat the swim bait. Now the last 3 baits I showed you were more aggressive reaction style baits. The next bait though is a little bit more of a finessey reaction bait, and I'm going to be throwing this if the fish are in a little bit of a negative mood or they get suspended over the top of that grass in the center of those ditches. This is the Megabass Trick Darter 80 jerkbait. It's a small little jerkbait that I've been throwing for years. Randy actually recommended these, and this jerkbait itself is like 13 years old that Randy recommended to me. And I've been throwing it for years on Lake Washita in the summertime, or in the wintertime, sorry, over the top of some offshore grass. The bait dives 6 to 8 feet deep, and a lot of that grass in Lake Washita will top out in that 8 to 10 foot range, and I'll work it over the top of the grass and get a lot of big bites. Because the grass on Lake Spavinaw is a little bit shallower in the center of those ditches, my plan is to throw this on a little bit heavier tackle and heavier line to keep it in that 4 to 6 foot range, just over the top of some of that deeper grass. Again, if we get some bright bluebird skies or some some tricky conditions like post-front conditions, a lot of times those fish will slide into the ditches and you can work the suspending jerkbait slow over the top of their head and get some of them to bite. To counteract the diving depth of this jerkbait, make it dive a little bit shallower, I have this on some 14-pound sun line, fluorocarbon line. It's a little bit heavier than I normally throw on a jerkbait. Usually I throw 10-pound Seagar and Vizex or sun line, either one. But this is some 14-pound FC Sniper sun line that will hopefully keep this bait about 1 to 2 foot shallower than it normally dives. The thicker the diameter of your line, the shallower these jerkbaits will dive. So by going from 10 to 14 pound test, it'll cut about 2 feet of diving depth off this bait. I'm pairing that on a 6/8 medium heavy action Denali AttaX series rod. I really like this rod. I tested it out my last fishing trip. Didn't really catch any fish on it, but I actually really enjoyed the action of it and has a nice soft tip to it as well. So I'm gonna keep experimenting with this rod. It's 129 bucks, which is a really good value. And I got it specifically to fish jerkbaits. So we'll see how it works on this fishing trip. The last bait I have rigged up to fish these shallow flats is a very finessey bait. This is a 5-inch Dimiki Stinger. Brian Thrift loves this bait. If you've ever heard him talk about bass fishing, he always talks about how he throws this Dimiki Stinger. It's basically a Senko style bait that works really well in shallow water and around offshore grass. I've caught some really big bass in the summer on Lake Spavinaw, just dead sticking this thing around areas where I got bit on reaction baits. If I get really tough conditions and I feel like I really need to slow down, I can fish this Dimiki Stinger really slow, dragging it through that grass, and if there's some fish there, they will eat this thing. I'm pairing it up on a 4/0 extra wide gap Gamakatsu worm hook, nothing too crazy. I'm just throwing it in a green pumpkin purple color. I'm pairing that up with a Fitzgerald rod just because I want to complete the Brian Thrift combo, and it's just a 7'3" medium heavy action Fitzgerald spinning rod. I really like this rod as well, and it has some nice guides on it. It has a pretty good tip, but it has a lot of backbone. So if I get those fish in that grass, I'll be able to set the hook and pull them out pretty easily. I'm pairing that up with some 20-pound Sunline braided line for my main line, and then I'm tying that to a 10-pound fluorocarbon leader, some FC Sniper by Sunline. Basically, the reason that I'm going with a 10-pound leader and 20-pound fluorocarbon is that I want to make sure I can pull those fish out of that grass if I get them tangled up or if they get caught up in the grass. A lot of times I'll throw a 6 and 8 pound test on my spinning rods, and I'll go to a 10-pound braided line, main line. But when I'm fishing around heavier cover and grass specifically, I'll go to 20-pound braided line with 10-pound fluorocarbon leader. Helps me get those fish out of that grass a little bit better, and we'll get some extra fish in the boat. So those are all the baits I plan on throwing on the offshore grass flats on Lake Spavinaw. Really quick, if you're interested in any of the baits or equipment I talked about in this video, I'll leave links to them down in the description below using my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. You can either use those links or go to my website, fishthemoment.com, and go to the Support Fish the Moment page. Here you'll find a link to my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. If you click on that, then bookmark it to your browser. Every single time you actually use that bookmark button or link on your browser, you'll be supporting Fish the Moment. That bookmark will stay there until you change computers, and even if you forget to use one of the links in my videos or from the website, you'll still be supporting me even if you forget. So I really appreciate it if you could bookmark those links and continue to support this type of content here at Fish the Moment. Now back to the topic at hand, I don't feel comfortable going into any fishing trip with only one strategy. Right now I've only talked about fishing those offshore grass flats, but there is a chance they may not work. Therefore, I do have one backup strategy that I know can produce some really big fish if I face adverse conditions. On a grass lake like Lake Spavinaw, adverse conditions for me are going to be post-front conditions with bluebird skies and no wind. This is going to make it very tough to locate fish on those offshore flats, which I'll get into in my Catch 15 video. I'll explain how I find fish on the grass flats and stuff like that in the video posting later this week. But also, it really hinders my ability to get bites on reaction baits. Therefore, my go-to strategy in post-front conditions with bluebird skies and no wind is to fish matted grass, especially matted grass that's close to deep water. Fortunately, in Lake Spavinaw, if we go down to the lower end of the lake, you'll notice there are several grass mats here on Google Earth. They're not that far off the bank, and the bottom of those grass mats, the base of those mats, might be in 3 to 6 feet of water. The grass then goes all up to the surface and tops out forming a literal mat or a wall of grass on top of the surface. On most of these grass mats, you'll find that the edge of that grass drops off very quickly into deeper water. So you'll have the edge of that grass in 4 to 6 foot, and then 10 or 12 feet in front of that grass, you'll be in 15 to 20 feet of water. This is the exact type of area that bass will be attracted to in these post-front conditions. My go-to bait for fishing these grass mats is a heavy jig. This is a 1 ounce AttaX heavy cover flipping jig, and I'm pairing it with a Jewel VersaCraw Junior trailer on the back. This 1 ounce jig will allow me to pitch it into those matted grass clumps, have it go down the bottom, and I'll just kind of shake it there and work it up and down. If there's any big bass that are using those mats for cover during the post-front conditions, this big jig will get them to bite. Now, I may have to switch over to a Texas rig if I'm not getting the number of bites I need on this jig, but I'm gonna start with the big jig always because it's going to produce the quality bites I need to complete my challenge. Usually you'll get more bites on the Texas rig and bigger bites on the jig, so start with the jig, then go to the Texas rig if you need to, and I'll just use like a 1 ounce tungsten weight with a creature bait on the back when I'm flipping with the Texas rig. To fish this bait, I'm just throwing it on a discontinued Quantum Greg Hackney Tour Edition rod. This rod is not made anymore, but it was designed by Greg Hackney to fish this exact jig, this 1 ounce jig with braided line. So it's the rod I'm gonna go with. It's 7'10" heavy action. And then I'm pairing that with some 50-pound Sunline braided line. I usually flip with 50-pound tests. Sometimes I'll go up to 65, but 50 is plenty. And just 50-pound braid, and I'm throwing that on a 6-3-1 Abu Garcia Black Max reel, 50 bucks. If I have to fish this jig pattern, usually it means I'm going to be struggling to finish out my limit because in those post-front conditions, you're not gonna get a ton of bites, but if I have a chance of completing my challenge in those conditions, it's probably going to be on a jig. I may also be able to catch him on the weightless Dimiki Stinger. That could be a bait that could work if I can locate those fish early enough in the day. But usually I need to locate them first with these reaction baits, then slow down with a slower moving bait to be able to effectively fish these flats. Again, I'll be getting into all my strategies, how I break down the grass lake and all those things in my upcoming Catch 15 video. So make sure to subscribe to the Fish Moment YouTube channel if you don't want to miss that upcoming video. And also check out all of my other Catch 15 challenges that I've been doing this year. They're really informative and I try to edit them and give as much information as possible to help you guys catch more fish on the lake. So anyways guys, thanks for checking out this video and we'll see y'all in the next video.